Today, we embark on the second half of the Goldberg Variations. As much as Bach was an artist, he was also a technician, a craftsperson, a master of his instrument. Besides his fame as an organist, he was also in high demand as an inspector of church organs. Reading his evaluations, you can see the technical side of his mind clearly. In one inspection, he warns that the bellows of an organ would overheat as a result of light hitting them from a west-facing window. Offhandedly, he also remarks that the organ maker skimped on materials, replacing tin with cheaper lead for pipes that were out of sight. I guess some things never change. Bach's notes on the organs he inspected remind us how exacting and even scientific he could be. Which is why I wanted to speak with Ken Kocienda, a renowned software engineer who was behind the development of the original Apple iPhone and who became deeply interested in the Goldberg Variations.
When it comes to music, I'm an amateur, really. And I'm a fan. And especially when speaking to people like Jeff, I'm part of the audience.
Jeff LaDeur is Kocienda's piano teacher, a concert pianist based in San Francisco, and a scholar of classical music. Kocienda contacted LaDeur and specifically asked if LaDeur could help him learn the Goldberg Variations. Learning the variations, having never played piano before, turned out to be a bit of an impossible task, but that didn't stop the two from becoming friends and from continuing to talk about the piece.
I'm someone who's, interested in this kind of music. And so I'm interested in buying CDs and DVDs like I have in front of me on the table here, interested in going out and seeing performances. And my interest then moved from that interest to asking myself, well, can I try this? Can I try to do this myself? Because I realized that I had opinions about the music as I was hearing it, listening to it, responding to it. And trying to ask myself, well, even though I'm over 50 years old now, and maybe that's a little bit late to be beginning musical studies, which I didn't have when I was younger. Is there something that I can discover about this music if I try to play it myself? Let me say this experiment has not been entirely successful. Jeff will be playing for you today, and not me.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. As much as I might like to share with you my concept of variations 16, 17, and 18.
But I sense that you see and perceive in the music things that are very similar to what you've done in your own creative life.
That's LaDeur talking.
You see certain shapes, you see certain patterns, you see certain unity in architecture, which, they're universal features of art and experience. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think... I agree. And it's one of the reasons why I find Bach's music so appealing in my career, in my professional life. Fortunately, I don't need to rely on music to pay the bills. But in my professional life, I was a programmer. I worked at Apple for many years, wrote software for the iPhone, iPad, for the Mac, for the Apple Watch. To work productively at Apple and in that kind of creative environment, you need to develop opinions. You need to know why you do something, or when you look at something, why you like it, when you experience something, what you think of it, and then to be able to defend that. And that also, my particular role was actually writing software. And so that is a field which doesn't have much room for error. You need to be very precise and very ordered and very methodical in your thinking. And so studying the music, trying to play the music that Bach wrote, I see so many of the same kinds of intellectual approaches to problems that I've seen in my years programming computers. I think Bach himself would have been a good programmer, would have been a good engineer.
Bach's music is governed by rules. Rules about harmony, like what notes go together in a scale, or what chords can follow one another. Rules about voicing, like which notes in a chord can be doubled and which can't. Rules about counterpoint, about how voices should imitate each other. Rules about structure, like which key areas to touch and in what order. One of Bach's sons once said that his father, quote, was never a friend of dry mathematical stuff. Bach didn't like rules for their own sake, but he clearly appreciated structure and order as a means of creating something beautiful, and the Goldbergs are a perfect example of that.
When he creates these structures, it's so he has a place to work. It's the same thing. A kind of structure implies a certain idea, a certain field that he's going to play in. And of course, what is so interesting to me about Bach is that no matter what he chose, he just seemed to have so many ideas, just an endless stream of ideas.
Bach's life had its own constraints too. He was always working for someone else, the church, the town council, a duke. He was the father to 20 children, although many of them didn't survive childhood. He was constantly working with musicians he found to be mediocre, and when he complained about it, getting chided by his superiors who didn't want to hear his griping. In one famous instance, while Bach was living in Arnstadt, he called a student bassoonist in his ensemble a prick of a bassoonist because he was whining that the solo Bach had written for him was too hard. A few weeks later, the student and his cronies exacted revenge, jumping Bach as he walked by the town hall. When Bach complained to the town council that his student had beaten him up, the council blamed Bach for not getting along with his students and suggested that he learn to live, quote, among imperfection. When I hear a story like that, I think of how the limitations and frustrations in Bach's life contrast with the beauty found in his music. I imagine his music as a kind of parallel universe to his life, one that's also severely bounded by rules, but ones that Bach knows and understands, ones that he can navigate and exploit, and within which Bach finds limitless possibilities.
I think limitation helps you compose, and Bach and the Goldberg Variations are perfect examples of that.
That's Rex Isenberg, a contemporary composer based in Los Angeles.
It's much easier to take a commission where somebody says, it's going to be 8 minutes long, it's going to be for this instrumentation, and this is a very specific subject matter that you're going to write on, than it is to say you have unlimited time and resources, because often you just don't know where to begin, frankly. Some limitation gives you direction in what it is that you need to do, and it allows you to reduce the universe of options available to a set of constraints that you can actually work with, and and it gives you a starting point so that you're not just kind of throwing in whatever fits.
João Luis, a Brazilian guitarist and composer, feels very similarly.
I think I love the discipline. I love to have structure. And I think counterpoint is something that gives me that. The more I do, the more I I'm able to freely express my ideas when I'm writing music.
This is music for guitar and harp by João Luis, which you'll hear more of in a later episode. Now back to Kocienda.
The question of constraints and art is and creativity is very, very interesting when you, as a creative person, say in the graphic arts, choose charcoal and paper as opposed to oil paint, or as opposed to watercolor, as opposed to pen and ink. All of these choices have constraints with them and imply something about what you might want to say in your picture. in my own work, probably the thing that I've done that I think maybe most people are most familiar with is that I worked on the original iPhone at Apple, and I wrote the code for the software keyboard.
Okay, pause. Kocienda was the principal engineer at Apple for iPhone software. He wasn't just some random programmer.
The whole goal of making this keyboard so that people could enter text on this touchscreen device that didn't have little plastic individual keys and kind of the style of an old BlackBerry smartphone was a constraint. And said, well then what do you do with that constraint? Well, that's where autocorrection came from.
Kocienda came up with the idea of autocorrection for the iPhone. And arguably, it was because he was constrained by the unique features of the product, the rules of its design. The difference, perhaps, between music and commercial software is that in music, the composer can also break the rules that he's created. This is another fascinating consequence of Bach being so strict about structure. When he does break his rules, it's to say something important. Here's Rex Isenberg again.
There's this moment in the Crucifixus in the B minor Mass where it's like right at the end, you hear this bass line pass through several times. I think over the course of, it's like a 3-minute piece. And it's like 12 times that you hear the same bass line.
This is the beginning of the piece. It can be hard to hear, but the bass line is repeating the same sequence of notes over and over again, slinking downward. C sharp, C sharp, C, 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 B, 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 E, 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 D sharp, D sharp, D, 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 C sharp, on and on and on.
There's one change at the very end. I think it's the penultimate rotation. And the bass lowers by like one note for 1 second. It goes down from a B to an A and then back up to a B again. And it's the first time that you hear that.
Listen very carefully for a kind of dip in the music. Now.
It triggers the very last statement, and it's so subtle. But your heart just drops at that moment when you hear the bass lower by a whole step and you're like, oh God, he's not going to make it. And it's so powerful. It's so subtle.
In that moment, Bach is breaking his own rule. And he only has to break it once to signal a transition to the end of the piece. Isenberg wrote me later about that moment, which his teacher first pointed out to him. He wrote that when he first saw it, he got choked up because of how subtle and brilliant it was, how it did so much with so little. Variation 16 of the Goldbergs breaks a rule right away.
It's a critical moment in the piece.
We're back with LaDeur. Despite the fact that we're in the middle of the piece, it feels like a new beginning, like some grand gates are opening before us.
We start the second half with an overture.
It's unusual to start the middle of a piece with an overture. Overtures normally come at the beginning, so Bach is maybe making a little bit of a musical joke here with an overture in the middle. But he still follows the strictures of the overture form. This is a French overture, which comes with a particular signature double-dotted rhythm that sounds like a heartbeat. Then, in the second half, it's traditional to change the meter, the number of beats in the bar, and include a fugue, which is exactly what Bach does. This fugue, like the canons we've been hearing, is all about imitation.
They have this scalar line. The next voice comes in immediately, and they start playing back and forth. So you can feel right away an alternation of attention.
Listen for the entrances of that first sequence of notes traveling down the registers. Then we get Variation 17.
It's a great contrast to 16 because you have that rigor of the double dot and then the lightness of that dance fugue, and then this is just all flow. Variation 17, I think, links to the previous in its use of rising thirds because of that fugue subject, which we heard so many times.
So that's from Variation 16, and now it's all outlining thirds, in the bass too.
It's all about the threes, and then the inversion of that, which is a sixth. It's kind of a variation on the third, I would say. Everything about it is in three. The time signature is in three, the interval is in three. It feels to me like an airborne variation where you're watching something ascend and something descend, and then they kind of meet in the middle and, you know, figure eight and then split again. There's a drama and a beauty to that.
Variation 18 brings us to the canon at the sixth. There are two voices in the canon, and the second voice comes in an interval of a sixth above the first voice. This variation is one of the most delicate of the piece.
There's something wonderful about each entrance has that little bell tone and then decay.
Once again, it's the top two voices of the canon that are singing back and forth to each other.
The top two voices, the canon proper, are essentially a chain of suspensions.
Suspensions are where one note in a chord hangs in the air while the harmony underneath it changes, creating a momentary clash.
One note doesn't belong. Well, it belongs and then it doesn't. So this belongs and now it doesn't. That belongs, now it doesn't.
This kind of writing has a long history in church music. This is an excerpt from a church sonata by Corelli, one of the great Baroque masters of suspensions. Listen for the brief tensions that ebb and flow in the music, created by the suspensions. So that's the tradition that Bach is drawing on with those upper voices.
And then what lends so much character to this is the bass line. It has so much personality. I mean, I hesitate to oversimplify and say sacred and secular, but it's a little bit. You know, you can imagine the first one in one of the church sonatas or something, and the bass line feels like it could be a folk dance.
As often happens in my interviews, LaDeur and I ended up sitting at the piano together, exploring what makes the variations special.
It's one of those pieces that has transcended its genre completely. It's a phenomenon.
I asked LaDeur if there were any other pieces like that for him.
It could partly be because of the key, but Schubert G major sonata has aspects of the peaceful nature.
This is LaDeur playing. I'm gonna let it run a bit, because it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, I know what it is. the reason I think I made the connection is because there's not this value placed on distance traveled. It's very much accepting where you are.
We started this episode talking about creativity within constraints, about how Bach, in his life outside of music, was limited by the need to earn a living, to support his family, to get along with his superiors and his students. He had a lot holding him in place. Which is why there's some symbolism to a piece like the Goldberg Variations, where Bach found a universe within the structured, limited world that he began with. Let's finish with LaDeur's Variations 16, 17, and 18. Thanks for listening. In this episode, you heard music played by Jeffrey LaDeur. You also heard a piece called 7 Meetings, composed by João Luis and played by Luis and harpist Bridget Kibbe. You also heard an excerpt from Bach's B minor Mass, performed by the Netherlands Bach Society. I'm very excited to introduce you to my interviewee for next week, a young pianist named Rachel Breen, who's as exuberant and playful as a musician as she is thoughtful and serious. Before we go, I want to thank my editor, David Schreiberg, for his continuous support for this project. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.